Sorry about that. Apparently we've been going the whole time and you've not been able to hear me, so I apologize for that. So let's back all the way back up and just kind of get a running start again into this study into the book of Judges, and specifically the judge Samson. This is lesson 8 of our study, and tonight we're going to focus on chapters 13 and 14 of the story of Samson. But before we get into Samson himself, we want to look at two overarching themes found in the book that Mark has highlighted throughout his study. The first is a statement that is repeated twice in the book of Judges, found in chapter 17 and chapter 21. And it's a statement about the condition of Israel's heart and their attitude toward God and the leaders that God sent, and who really governed their actions. And that verse simply states this: there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The only source of authority the people of God recognized mainly at this time is whatever they desired themselves. They acted as their own director and own director of their steps. They didn't really pay attention to God and God's desires, and when he sent a leader, they quickly forgot him. Really, they were governed by their emotions and their desires and the things that they wished to do. The second overarching theme that I think is important for us to look at is found in Judges chapter 2 and verse 19. And there the writer says this: "But it came about when the judge died that they would turn back," talking about the people, "and act more corruptly than their fathers, and following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not abandon their practices or their stubborn ways." And what this verse really points to is fact, when we read through the Judges, we see really a digression, a de-evolution, of people drawing further away from God. We see that in their judges. When we first begin with Othniel, he seems a man of high standing, of good character, a person of integrity, a person who wanted to please God. But each successive judge, even though they showed moments of faith and accomplished what God desired for them to accomplish, they seemed to move further and further away from God. But it was not only the judge themselves, because the judge really represented the people. The people drew further and further away from God. Each successive judge, they would turn back to God for a period of time, but as soon as that judge passed away, or his influence was no longer felt, the people turned away from God, and the state they found themselves in was worse than previously. They continued this digression or de-evolution, if you will, all throughout the period of Judges. And such is the case when we come to the judge Samson. When we get to chapters 13 and 14 and begin to look at Samson, we need to recognize he's the last so-called judge of this period, at least of the book, in the book of Judges. We'll have Samuel, really, as we begin on in 1 Samuel. But in the book of Judges, he is the 12th of those so listed. He is the 6th of the major judges in this book. And we need to look at really the story of Samson as a whole. The story of Samson fits into 3 major or neat episodes. The first episode involves his birth, and it's all of chapter 13. In the episode 2, we have his marriage to a woman, Timnah, and the events some of the events that arise out of that action, and that takes up chapters 14 and 15. In episode 3, we have the events surrounding his arrest, the interaction with Delilah, the cutting of his hair, and actually ultimately his death in chapter 16. Each of these narrative sections are really kind of distinct from one another and are almost told like a mini-series, like we would watch on cable television, as a series of stories that are looped together to kind of give us a complete picture of the life of Samson. Again, I want us to spend just a few moments kind of looking at the big picture of the story of Samson, because even among the judges, the things about Samson and his life, they're just unique. They're just kind of odd. They're different than the sequences of events that we see in many of the other judges. And there's just something unique about Samson that we need to look at as we run through this story together. And that begins really with the opening sequence. In chapter 13, verse 1, we read this: "Now the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, so that the Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. He says he gave them into the hands of the Philistines. Really, the Philistines had been on the scene during the time of Jephthah. Back up to chapter 10 and verse 7, where it says, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of the Philistines and into the hands of the sons of Ammon. Jephthah dealt with the Ammonite threat, but the threat of the Philistines still loomed large and still was in the heart of the people. The Philistines were a warlike people that were governed by several city-states, 5 principal city-states, 5 capital cities that had their own little chiefs or kings, if you will. The cities of Gath and Ashkelon and Ashdod and Gaza and Escalon. One of the principal ways that the Philistine influence was felt was their ability or their discovery or proficiency to make iron weapons. This was really the Bronze Age, if we want to use that nomenclature, and the Philistines had discovered the ability or had a proficiency in producing iron weapons, making their weapons, their farm implements, even their chariots of greater strength and sharpness than the tools of most of the peoples that they came around. And as they came in contact with these foreign peoples, the ones they didn't subjugate outright, they were able to influence through trade and ultimately intermarriage and then business, because everyone wanted these iron implements. But we can't overlook the fact that it wasn't just that kind of influence that led them to have oversight or they overlorded over the people of Israel. It was the Lord that gave them Israel into the hands of the Philistines. But what I want us to really focus on in verse 1 is kind of a break in the pattern, if you will. We've noticed this pattern where the people did evil and God sent a nation to judge them, and for a period of time the nation would oppress them, and eventually they would cry out to the Lord, and God would send a deliverer based upon their repentance, and he would deliver them. In this case, we have no reference to them crying out to the Lord. There's no cry for deliverance. There's no pleading for the Lord for them to deliver them from the hands of the Philistines. Now, there might be a couple reasons for that. One of the reasons may be it's just assumed in the text. Because God does send Samson, ultimately raise Samson up to begin the deliverance of the people, it may just be assumed that they cried out. But there's also the suggestion as we run through the Samson story that they weren't really interested in overthrowing the Philistines. They'd gotten used to it. They learned to deal with it on their own, and they just were satisfied with the status quo. Just think about some of the people in this story of the judge Samson. You have his parents, Manoah and his wife. How did they deal with the Philistines? They just tried to avoid them. They weren't really upset about them. They're over there and we're over here. How did Samson deal with the Philistines? In large measure, even though he at different times battled with them, took out his displeasure and anger against them, for the most part, he wanted to be like them. He seemed to have a fascination with Philistine women, and he seemed to have a fascination with Philistine culture and ideas. He wanted to be like them. And the people themselves, look with me, if you will, in chapter 15. In chapter 15, in verse 11, we have this little insight. When the men of Judah go down to where Samson is hiding, it says in verse 11, then the 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom and said to Samson, do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us? And he said to them, as they did to me, so I have done to them. So the men of Judah, these 3,000 men of Judah, they approached Samson and really they upbraid him for making trouble for them. Don't you know that the Philistines are rulers over us? And look at the next phrase. What then have you done to us? They seemed at least resigned to the Philistine overlordship over them. So there doesn't seem to be a cry of deliverance here in the story of Samson. Another thing that's kind of unique about Samson, all of chapter 13 is taken up with this birth narrative. How Mrs. Manoah is barren, and then the angel of God or the angel of the Lord or a man of God comes to her and blesses her with a child. That's kind of unique among the judges, at least in the book of Judges. It's reminiscent of Hannah and Samuel when we get to the book of 1 Samuel, or maybe reminiscent of other births like this, whether it's Sarah or ultimately John the Baptist. But this is kind of unique in this book, where this one, even from his mother's womb, was going to be raised up by the Lord to accomplish his purposes. Also kind of unique among the judges is the interplay with Samson and what we know as the Nazarite Vow. The Nazarite Vow is really recorded for us in Numbers chapter 6, and it has three primary components to it. That the person who made this vow would abstain absolutely from anything associated with the fruit of the vine, which was wine or strong drink or any of the derivatives like that. They would not allow a razor to touch their head, but would let their hair grow naturally as a crown to God. And finally, the third idea, they would not draw near to anything dead, a dead person, including members of their own family. So we have this interplay of this one Samson who was to be a Nazarite from his birth. And even then, it's kind of unique. Most of the times when people became Nazarites, it was a voluntary vow they entered into. They chose to enter into this. But not so with Samson. Samson from his mother's womb was chosen. It was almost involuntary. The other thing about the Nazarite vow is typically it was limited in duration. It was for a limited period of time. And at that end of the time, the hair would be cut off and offered as a sacrifice to the Lord. But here for Samson, his life, his entire life was to be spent as a Nazarite. And there's one other unique feature here, at least in Judges chapter 13. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Mrs. Manoah, he told her that you have borne no children, that you're going to give birth to a son, verse 3. Now look at verse 4. Now therefore be careful not to drink wine or strong drink, nor eat any unclean thing. That's not stated back in Numbers chapter 6. I mean, it was kind of assumed that the people of God would not eat anything that's unclean, but by this time in Israel's history, that seemed to be par for the course. They were willing to eat anything, even those things which are unclean, but he reminded her because her son was going to be a Nazarite, she couldn't eat any foods that were unclean. So God raises up someone to rescue his people. And the reason I have it as a question mark, because Samson's just kind of different. I mean, much of this story is on the individual focus of Samson, what Samson himself will do. He doesn't rally any armies. He doesn't rally the people. He doesn't march out to overthrow anyone. He's just really, in many respects, we might use the words a nuisance. He just kind of kept upsetting their apple cart, but it's primarily an individual focus. And notice what it says in verse 5. When he tells Mrs. Manoah, he says, "For behold, you shall conceive and give birth to a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the boy shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines." Do you see that phrase? He shall begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines. No, Samson's job wasn't to be the deliverer like Jephthah was, or even Gideon, or other judges who were raised up. His job, given to him by God through the angel of God, is to begin to deliver the Philistines. In many ways, it seems to me his primary job was to keep the Philistines from settling in and solidifying their hold. He was to provoke discontent between Israel and the Philistines. He was to keep tensions high and prepare for their eventual overthrow. He was to begin to deliver them. The other unique thing about the stories of Samson, we see all kinds of riddles and puzzles in the story of Samson. We think about the one in chapter 14 and verse 14, when he makes this riddle to his 30 companions, Philistine companions, at the wedding of his first wife. He says, "Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet." And we think about even how he expressed his displeasure at the end of the story in verse 18. If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. Or even in chapter 15, when he goes out and kills 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey, he sets his escapades, his accomplishments in the form of a poem in verse 16. With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps with the jawbone of a donkey, I have killed 1,000 men, or smitten 1,000 men. So we don't find this really in the rest of the Judges. I mean, we find some parables with Jotham, the surviving brother of Abimelech, but we don't find these riddles or puzzles. And maybe it's led many people to speculate, but just to suggest that Samson's an enigma. He is a puzzle. We really don't know what to make of him. He seems like this self-willed, driven guy who's ruled by his own pleasures, and yet God uses him to accomplish his purposes. And the final thing I guess we want to point out about Samson, of all the judges, the 12 judges mentioned in the book of Judges, his is the longest narrative. I mean, Gideon's is close if you include the story about Abimelech, but I don't believe Abimelech was a judge. But so of all the judges, his story is the longest. And then maybe in some ways that too is intentional, because as much as all the judges represented the people of God of their time, Samson in some ways represented the story of God's people. I mean, his birth, he was just this prodigy. He was miraculously born by the will of God. He's called to this high life of separation and devotion to God as a Nazarite. But yet, what do we find in Samson? He's rash, he's opportunistic, he's immature. He's ultimately he's ultimately drawn to foreign women, like Israel was drawn to foreign gods. They both played the harlot. Samson ultimately experiences bondage and oppression by the enemy when he's robbed of his strength. He ultimately cries out to God from his oppression when he's blinded, like Eli was in 1 Samuel chapter 3. And what we find, and he didn't even recognize it, is that Jehovah abandoned him until he cried out to him. And so in some ways, he really becomes a picture of Israel during this period of time. So, saying all that, let's jump into the story. Tonight we're going to really cover this birth narrative, episode 1, and begin his marriage to the lady of Timnah, or at least his engagement. There's some question about that based upon different customs. But we're only going to look at that tonight, chapters 13 and 14. Chapter 13, as I already mentioned, revolves around the miraculous intervention of God into the life of Mrs. Manoah, the wife of Manoah, Samson's father. And what we have in chapter 13 are two different theophanies, appearances of God or the angel of God. And the first is found in verses 1 through 7. And we're introduced there to Samson's father, a Minoan, or a man by the name of Manoah, who was a Danite from Zorah. He was of the tribe of Dan, and the city of Zorah was roughly 18 miles due west of Jerusalem. And Dan itself bordered the coast, and they would be in direct conflict with the nation of Philistia in their city-states. And so that is where the individual that we find, the angel of the Lord, he ends up speaking to his wife. And what we have here, it seems to be an unstated request. We don't see Mrs. Manoah or Manoah himself crying out to the Lord, asking for a child, but we see the Lord recognizing their need, their barren state, and him sending the angel of the Lord, as is described in verse 3, to pronounce his blessings upon this couple. Now, in the first 7 verses, we have this angel of the Lord, and Mrs. Manoah recognizes him or calls him a man of God. She doesn't really recognize who he is. But she does recognize him in verse 6 and His appearance was like an angel of God, and he was very awesome. And he came and delivered this news to her. He made two promises. One, you're going to have a son. Secondly, that son is going to begin to deliver the people. He's going to begin to deliver Israel in verse 5. And as a result of that, he pronounces two blessings, or Samson is to be twice blessed. He is going to be a Nazarite, consecrated, set aside for God's purposes, and he is the firstborn to get the double blessing. So he receives twice the blessing. But the second appearance occurs beginning in verse 18 and runs all the way through the end of chapter 13. And it begins to give us, I believe, a little insight into the character of Samson's parents. And unfortunately, we get a little insight into the character of Manoah. In verse 8, we read this. When Manoah's wife came and reported to him what had transpired, Manoah said, well, I want to confirm this. I want to see this person for ourselves. And look what he says in verse 8. Then Manoah entreated the Lord and said, O Lord, please let the man of God whom you see come to us, again that he may teach us what to do for the boy who is to be born. And we see this plural pronoun pronounced from Manoah's lips all the way through this section, but the angel of God never really appears to him. He appears again to Manoah's wife. And so we might just be getting a little bit of insight into Manoah's character. He may be showing himself to be put upon or feel left out in this midst. But the God acquiesces, and the angel of the Lord appears to him again. And Manoah comes to him. He appears to Manoah's wife, and Manoah comes up in verse 10 and 11. And he says, are you the man who spoke to the woman? And we have this two-word phrase, I am. Now, I don't know what to make of that. A lot of people, as we know, that is the name that God claims for himself. We have the 7 I am statements of the Gospel of John. I am who I am. Or it could just be a reference to an acknowledgement of Manoah's question, but just kind of keep that in mind. And so as we continue through this story, we get a little more insight into who the messenger from God is. He's described as a man of God, awesome of appearance. He's described both as the angel of the Lord and the angel of God. Manoah wants to prepare a young goat for him. And he says, no, you can't do that. Make an offering to the Lord instead. He's described himself when he's asked his name. He says, my name is too wonderful. It's too incomprehensible for you. And when the flame of the sacrifices goes up, the angel of the Lord steps into the flame and ascends to the heavens. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Manoah think this is God. That's their conclusion in verse 22. They said in verse 22, so Manoah said to his wife, we will surely die, for we have seen God. And without speculating a lot, there is so much in this story, it's hard to imagine this is not a theophany, an appearance of God in some way. Mark on separate occasions has talked a little bit about the angel of the Lord, or the angel of God, how it is not like other angels, but it is an expression of who God is, of his character and his purpose. And many people believe this is the pre-incarnate Christ who appeared to Manoah and his wife here on this occasion. It does seem to be something special, whether we can go that far or not. So think about this story. You have a set of parents who the wife is barren, unable to bear children. And even though the request or the cry is not made, the plea is not made to God, God sees their plight and sends someone to heaven to reassure them that he was going to bless them with a child, but not only bless them with a child, but a child that is going to be holy and set apart to him, and he's going to do wondrous things, begin to deliver Israel. When the wife hears that, she goes and tells her husband, and the husband kind of wants more confirmation, and he pleads to the Lord a second time to let this man of God come again, and God grants his request. And he allows the flames of the altar to carry himself to heaven, this grand vision. How would you expect this story to end? You'd think it'd end on a high note, right? With people praising God and extolling the greatness of God. But what do we see in verse 24? Then the woman gave birth to a son, and she named him Samson. And the child grew up, and the Lord blessed him. Anybody know what the name Samson actually means? In Hebrew, it can mean son. But the most common derivation of the word Samson is a recognition of the sun deity of the Canaanites. So here you're blessed by the Lord, and they recognize it as the Lord, and you give your son a name, at the very least, that has a mixed meaning. You don't see something like Samuel, God recognizing God's blessing, or anything with the name El in it. You see the name Samson, where they are still mixed up with the people of the land. But as chapter 13 draws to a close, we see the Spirit of the Lord beginning to stir in Samson and getting ready to prepare him for the work that God intended for him to do. We're not told anything about his growing up. We're not told anything more about it. Just his birth, and then when God begins to stir him up in the land between Zorah and Eshtaol. So we turn to chapter 14, and we begin to look at his interactions with the people of Philistia. And we're going to take just the time, even though we're drawing close, to read verses 1 through 9 together. It says, Then Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. So he came back and told his father and mother, I saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore give her for me as a wife. Then his father and his mother said to him, Is there no woman among the daughters of your relatives, or among all our people, that you go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she looks good to me. However, his father and his mother did not know that it was of the Lord, for he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. Now at that time the Philistines were ruling over Israel. Then Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother, and came as far as the vineyards of Timnah. And behold, a young lion came roaring toward him. The Spirit of the Lord come upon him mightily, so that he tore him as one tears a young goat, though he had nothing in his hands. But he did not tell his father or mother what he had done. So he went down and talked to the woman, and she looked good to Samson. And when he returned later to take her, he turned aside to look at the carcass of the lion. And behold, a swarm of bees and honey were in the body of the lion. So he scraped the honey into his hands and went on eating as he went. When he came to his father and mother, he gave some to them, and they ate it. And he did not tell them that he scraped the honey out of the body of the lion. So as this tale begins, we see really God's interaction with Samson and the people of the land, setting the stage for conflict. We see that in verse 4, where it said the Lord was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. We see it in verse 19, where the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 men and took their spoil and gave the changes of clothes to those who told the riddle. Again, we see the Lord's interactions and wanting to stir up animosity between the people of the land and the Philistines. But the big thing that we see in spite of that is the character of both Samson and his parents in this text. And that's what makes this text so difficult for us to understand sometimes. We look at Samson, and right from the beginning, we see him going to places that he shouldn't go. He went down to Timnah. Timnah was a Philistine city. And while it was relatively close, 4 to 6 miles roughly between Zorah and Timnah, there's a line of demarcation. There's a city of God, a city of the people of God, and a city that belongs to the Philistines. And Samson went down there. And that phrase, he went down to Timnah, while that may be geographically accurate, I want you to know it crops up over and over again in Samson's life. And it talks about him drawing away from God and his people and drawing closer to the Philistines. Look at verse 5. Then Samson went down to Timnah. Verse 7. So he went down and talked to the woman. Verse 19. He went down to Ashkelon. Chapter 15 and verse 8. He went down and lived in the rock of Etham. I mean, we see this as he pulls away. He goes downward away from God's people. The second thing we see about Samson's character here is it says he saw a woman in Timnah. It seems to me that Samson in large measure is ruled or dominated by his senses, his emotions. And literally, I want you to see what the text says. So it said it saw a woman in verse 14. He goes on in verse 3. He tells his father, "Get her for me, for she looks good to me." And what do you think that phrase literally means? She is right in my eyes. When he looks at this woman in Timnah, she's a good-looking woman in his eyes. And he says, she is right in my eyes. And that parallels what the children of Israel did to God. They did what was right in their own eyes, just like Samson did. The other thing that reveals something about Samson, look how he talks to his parents. I mean, what does he say at the end of verse 3? He says to his father, "Get her for me." That's a command. That's not a request. That's not a plea. Samson's ordering his parents around. It seems to me that is showing somewhat his disregard for authority. And that's what we see throughout Samson's life. Both his respect for God is absent, his respect for the Philistines, who are mightier in him in many cases, and even disrespect for his parents. Another insight into his character is his interaction with this lion. As they're on their way to the Timnah, this lion jumps out of the bush, and the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Samson, and he rends it in two. Now, because the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, you indicate that the Lord wanted to save his life. But you know what Samson was required to do after he come in contact with a dead body? He was to go back and reconsecrate himself. There was an 8-day ritual that he was to immerse himself in. You read in Numbers chapter 6, verses 9 through 11. He was to shear his hair. He was to offer burnt offerings. And he was to reconsecrate himself to the Lord. It's like he begins his vow anew. But he didn't have time for that. And furthermore, when he comes back and he looks at this carcass, a carcass which would normally be filled with flies and maggots and all types of carrion and pests, it's full of honey. And what's he do? He just scoops it out of that dead body and begins to eat it. And not only that, he gives it to his parents and doesn't tell them. So not only does he defile himself, he defiles those around them without a thought or care in the world. What we see in Samson is he begins to act like the Philistines. If you jump down, if you will, in verse 10, when they go down to the Timnah, it says, "Then his father went down to the woman, and Samson made a feast there." And notice this last phrase, "For the young men customarily did this." He's not talking about his Jewish young men. He's talking about men of Philistia. When Samson goes down to Timnah to secure himself for this wife, he makes this feast, and he begins to observe the customs of the land, of the people of Philistia. He wants to be like his oppressors. He wants to be like the rulers. He wants to be like the Philistines. And that's how he treats them in the rest of the story. For every action, there's an opposite and a reaction. There is a vengeance cycle that goes on throughout this story. So listen to this as how it goes. The Philistines want Samson for slaughtering their own people, but he had done it because they had killed his wife and father-in-law. But they had done this because he had burned their fields. But he had done this because his father-in-law had given away his wife. But he had done this because Samson had gotten angry and left. But he had done this because his wife had given the riddle answers to his kinsman. But she had done this to keep from being burned up. You see this cycle of vengeance and retaliation. Just as the Philistines did, so did Samson. And so we get a kind of a glimpse into Samson's character, and it's not the best thing to look at. But I also think we get an insight into his parents. I mean, in verse 3, when he comes and tells them that he wants this woman from Timnah to be his wife, they initially oppose him, verse 3. Then his father and his mother said to him, "Is there no woman among the daughters of your relatives, among all our people, that you go take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?" I mean, they use that phrase which comes out of Exodus chapter 34 and Deuteronomy chapter 7 and says it's unlawful for you to have this woman as your wife because she belongs to the land. She is not of God's people. She is of the uncircumcised. But yet, what ends up happening? They end up going down to Timnah with him. He tells them, I want her as a wife. They acquiesce, and we see them journeying down to Timnah with him. And it seems to me, at least the way this interaction is played out, that's not the first time this happened. That they may have acquiesced before, and this has become a pattern behavior in their relationship between parent and child. And so the rest of chapter 14 is taking up with his wedding, this riddle, and then the vengeance that he is to exercise. He goes down to Timnah. He makes this feast. They assign him 30 companions. And there's a lot of questions about that, what that means, if that's part of the customs of the Philistines, if they're like 30 bridegrooms, or those were 30 people who were going to watch over Samson and make sure he didn't get out of line. We don't know. But during the course of this wedding feast, he proposes this riddle based upon the line that he claimed. They make a wager about 30 linen wraps and 30 changes of clothing and set a time deadline, 7 days. And he says, if you answer my riddle, then I'll give you this. But it's got to be within that time frame. And here's the riddle. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. And they apparently puzzled and pondered that riddle for 3 days and couldn't draw close to an answer. So they tried to game the system. They approached his wife and told them to entice your husband, or we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited this person down to impoverish us? And so Samson's wife weeps before him. What a wedding celebration, right? For the next 7 days, it says, she weeps during the feast. I mean, what a celebration of their union. She just cries the whole time. And eventually, Samson gives in and explains the riddle to her. And she passes it on to the sons of her people. And Samson is full of anger. And he says, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. And he goes down to one of their capital cities, to the city of Ashkelon, and kills 30 of the Philistines, takes their garments, and uses that to settle his debt. As a result, this wife of his youth is given to a companion who had been Samson's friend. So that's the beginning of his deliverance, if you will, of the Philistines. So what should we learn from this story? There's just so many lessons. I'm just going to propose a handful to you. There are a number of lessons he's touched on that are apropos even to this judge. But I guess I want to just see the potential that exists in Samson. I mean, he's a Nazarite from his mother's womb. He's to be consecrated God from the day of his birth. And yet this is the kind of character that we see. You know what? Potential is only that. It's potential. If it's not realized, all it is potential. The preacher in Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 1, he talks about a good name, and then he says the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. And I think about that a lot, and what I think he's saying there is potential has been realized. At the day of one's death, at the day of one's birth, all you've got is this potential. You don't know how a person's going to turn out, if they're going to serve God, follow God, live a life of wisdom and integrity, but that at the day of their death, their potential for good or ill has been realized. Unfortunately for Samson, as we kind of move through this story, so much of his potential goes unrealized. The second thing I'm struck by in chapter 13 is the lack of spiritual perception. I mean, this angel of God appears to Mrs. Manoah. She thinks it's a man of God that looks like an angel of God. It's almost like they couldn't really even conceive of the idea that God would appear to them. And maybe I'm being too hard on them, but it seems to me there is a spiritual perception problem. I think often about the prayer in Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 18, where the Apostle Paul just says this, to open the eyes of our heart. He said, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened, so you will know what is the hope of his calling, or the riches of the glory of his inheritance in the saints. That our spiritual perception problem will be fixed, and we will realize the greatness of the God that we serve and the hope that we have. I don't think you can read this story, even though I don't think it's the intent of this story, to see how God regards life. Samson was to be a Nazarite from his birth, but you know what his mom had to be? During his pregnancy, she had to be a Nazarite because it would affect Samson. God recognizes life even in the womb. And I don't think you can read this interaction without seeing that. I know people want to argue it's not. I mean, how this fetus, when does it feel? God seemed to recognize within the womb that Samson needed to be treated as a Nazarite to be established from his birth. I think there's some parenting 101 in this text. And if you're going to say no, you got to be consistent with it. You can't capitulate. Because that's what we see in the story of Samson's parents. They first say no, she's an uncircumcised Philistine. The fact of the matter is her spiritual status doesn't change throughout this story. Yet, they go down to Timnah with him and set up the feast and join him in the feast. They capitulate. If something's wrong, it's wrong. If it's right, it's right. And as parents, we need to learn the lessons of consistency. And I guess the final one I'll just throw out for your consideration is just one that we see in every story. It's God's grace and God's ability. Even though Israel didn't cry out, even though we don't have Mrs. Manoah crying out, God graciously responded to their need before they even spoke it aloud. But not only that, we see God's power. He could take someone, even someone like Samson, and accomplish his purpose. And you say, someone like Samson, he's super strong. Yeah, but he's someone who is self-willed. He's someone who's driven by his emotions, who does what is right in his own eyes, but God can take even that person and accomplish his purposes. And so he does in the story of Samson. So that's the lesson for tonight. Mark will pick up in chapter 15 and continue with the story of Samson and throughout the rest of the Judges. I hope I've given you something you can think about and chew on tonight. Again, I'll remind those who are just joining us or have joined us during the class, there will not be a Zoom meeting afterwards. Mark will pick those back up next Wednesday. If you have any questions or comments from this class or the class he's going to teach, jot those down and you all can discuss those next Wednesday night. So thank you for joining us. Sorry about the technical difficulties right at the start. It was all on my end. I thought I had pushed a button and I had not. So thank you for bearing with us during that time. I hope you have a great rest of the week, and if you got free time, join me tomorrow night as we continue our study in evidences at 7:30. We're going to be looking at some evidences for Jesus, and Jesus being the Son of God, and kind of begin a study in that. Hope you have a great rest of the week, and look forward to interacting with you again. Thank you.